The cell walls were not made of concrete or steel. They were made of something that felt uncomfortably like skin, warm to the touch, and pulsing with a faint, rhythmic bioluminescence. Stanley sat with his back against the corner, feeling the vibration travel through his spine. The worst part was not the confinement. The worst part was that the room seemed to be synchronizing with him. When his heart rate spiked, the violet veins running through the membrane brightened. When he forced his breathing to slow, the ambient hum of the chamber dropped an octave. It was a bioprison, a living stomach, designed to digest not flesh, but will. A voice filtered down from the ceiling, not from a speaker, but resonating through the bone-like ridges overhead. It was a synthetic voice, smooth and devoid of jagged edges. Subject 7 Alpha. Resonance calibration will commence in 20 minutes. Please center your thoughts. Panic creates static. Static reduces data fidelity. Stanley let out a short, dry laugh that scraped against his throat. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles rough from years of holding rifles and steering columns, but they were steady. I survived the siege of Antares just to be killed by background music, he muttered to the empty room. Calibration. That is a nice word for execution. He stood up. His knees popped a reminder of his age and the miles he had put on his body. He approached the door, or what passed for a door, a semi-translucent seal that looked like a cataract on a giant eye. He knew it was futile, but the soldier in him refused to sit and wait for the end without testing the perimeter one last time. He pulled his arm back and drove his fist into the seal. He expected the jarring impact of a force field or the bruised knuckles of hitting hyperglass. Instead, the material gave way. It did not break. It softened. The surface rippled like water under tension, wrapping around his fist, warm and wet. A sudden sharp sensation shot up his arm. Not pain, but a violation of privacy. Images flashed behind his eyes, the smell of ozone, the scream of a dropship engine, the feeling of mud sucking at his boots. The wall was reading him. It was tasting his adrenaline and his memory. Stanley yanked his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He stumbled backward, breathing hard. The wall rippled again, then settled back into its solid state, but the violet light pulsed faster, agitated. "Get out of my head," Stanley hissed. "Talking to the furniture, I heard solitary does that to people, but you are setting a record for speed." The voice came from the other side of the translucent seal. It was female, sharp, and laced with a teasing lilt that sounded entirely out of place in a high-security digestion chamber. Stanley froze. He watched as a shadow moved across the milky surface of the door. "Who is there?" he asked. "Someone who thinks you look terrible in violet lighting," the voice replied. "Step back, unless you want your eyebrows singed off, which honestly might be an improvement." Stanley took 2 steps back. The door did not slide open. It unraveled. A beam of concentrated orange light sliced through the membrane, but it did not burn. It acted like a needle, picking at a loose thread. The reality of the barrier seemed to snag, pull, and then unzip. The organic material retracted with a wet squelching sound, revealing the corridor beyond. Standing there was a figure that looked like she had walked out of a chaotic dream. She was tall, encased in a sleek patchwork armor of leather and scavenged alloy. Her helmet was tucked under her arm, revealing a face that was distinctly alien, yet undeniably expressive. Her skin was covered in a fine coat of russet fur that thickened around her neck and cheeks. 2 large triangular ears atop her head swiveled, independently tracking sounds he could not hear. Her eyes were gold, slit-pupiled, and currently narrowed in amusement. She was a vulpari, or at least that was the street name for her species. Foxkin, hunters. "You are still alive," she said, sounding mildly surprised. She looked him up and down, her tail flicking behind her with a restless energy. "I bet you have disappointed a lot of people by not dying on schedule." Stanley straightened his spine, instinctively adopting a defensive posture. Did you come here to rescue me or to grade my performance? A little of column A, a little of column B. She holstered the device she had used to open the door, a strange, tuning fork-shaped tool that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. The name is Alice. I am the reason you are not going to become nutrient paste for the architecture today. Now move. We are on a timer. Stanley stepped into the hallway. The floor here was spongy, giving slightly under his boots. The air smelled like ozone and wet earth. He looked left, then right. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, curving gently, like the intestine of a leviathan. "Where are the guards?" Stanley asked. He kept his voice low. "The suppression drones. The alarms." Alice paused, her ears twitching forward. She tapped the side of her temple. "That is the million-credit question, isn't it? I bypassed the outer lock, but I expected a welcoming committee by now. Sirens. Lockdown protocols. Screaming." She looked at the ceiling. The bioluminescent veins were pulsing slowly, lethargically. "Nothing," she whispered. "No sirens, no red lights. It is quiet, too quiet." "Maybe they are asleep," Stanley suggested, though he did not believe it. "This place is built on top of the glass maw," Alice said, her tone tightening. "It does not sleep. It waits. Come on." She took off at a sprint, her gait loping and agile. Stanley followed, forcing his heavy boots to keep pace. As they ran, the walls began to react to their presence. The violet light shifted to an angry crimson where Stanley passed as if the building itself was allergic to him. Then came the ghosts. It started as a flicker in his peripheral vision, a shadow on the wall that did not match his own. Stanley blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the shadow sharpened. It peeled itself off the wall and projected into the air in front of him a three-dimensional hologram, constructed of light and memory. It was a burning building. The structure was jagged, torn apart by artillery. Stanley stumbled. He knew this building. He had stood in front of it 10 years ago on the colony moon of Vesta 4. "No!" he gritted out, pushing forward. The hallway stretched warping. The floor became mud. The air filled with the phantom scent of cordite and burning plastic. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. A child, small, wearing a jacket that was too big, standing amidst the rubble. The child was looking at him, hand outstretched, mouth open in a silent scream. Stanley felt a physical blow to his chest. This was the moment. The command had been to retreat. The interference field was collapsing. He had turned back. He had tried, but the distance was too great. He saw his own hand reaching out in the projection fingers, brushing empty air as the collapse took the building. "It is not real," Alice's voice cut through the haze, sharp as a whip crack. Stanley gasped, coming to a halt. He was shaking. The projection was so dense he could feel the heat on his skin. "It is defense mechanism," Alice said. She had stopped ahead of him, looking back with an unreadable expression. Her ears were pinned flat against her head. "The prison reads your trauma and projects it to incapacitate you. It wants you to stop. If you stop it, eats you." Stanley looked at the child in the smoke. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He wanted to fall to his knees and apologize to a ghost. "Stanley," Alice barked. She did not use his rank or his surname. She used the name on his file. "Move, now." He clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. He forced his legs to move. He stepped through the image of the child. It felt like walking through freezing water. The image shattered into sparks of light, dissolving back into the crimson walls. "I am moving," Stanley rasped. He caught up to her, sweat stinging his eyes. "Does it do that to everyone?" "Only the ones with enough damage to be interesting," Alice said, turning back to the run. But Stanley noticed she kept her eyes strictly forward, refusing to look at the walls herself. They took a sharp left turn, sliding on the slick floor, and burst into a junction room. Standing there frantically typing on a holographic interface that was floating above a severed nerve cluster of the building was a man in a tattered lab coat. He looked up, eyes wide, behind thick spectacles that had been repaired with tape. "You are late," the man hissed. "The biorhythm is spiking. We have maybe 4 minutes before the antibodies wake up." "Traffic was bad," Alice deadpanned. "Stanley, meet Dr. Rowan Vale. He is the brains. I am the looks. You are the package." Stanley looked at the doctor. "You are the one who hired a bounty hunter to break into a supermax prison." "I am a linguist," Dr. Vale corrected, his hands flying across the light keys. "And she is not just a bounty hunter, and you are not just a prisoner. Please, we have no time for introductions. The maw knows you are loose. It is agitated." "The maw?" Stanley asked. "The anomaly this prison was built to contain," Vale explained, his voice trembling slightly. "It is not just a singularity. It is a frequency, a song that eats reality. And you, my friend, are a resonance point. Your neural architecture hums in a way the maw finds delicious. That is why they keep you here. You are not an inmate. You are a pacifier." "I have no idea what you just said," Stanley said. "It means you are bait," Alice translated. "And we are stealing the bait." "Done," Vale shouted, hitting a final key. A heavy sphincter lock on the far wall, dilated opening, a dark service tunnel. "Into the quiet room, quickly." They scrambled through the opening. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the oppressive humming of the prison vanished. The silence was sudden and absolute. The walls here were dead, metal cold, and lifeless. "Shielded pocket," Vale whispered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The organism cannot see inside here. We are safe for a moment." Stanley leaned against the cold metal, grateful for the surface that did not try to read his mind. "Why me? There are thousands of veterans with PTSD. Why am I special?" "It is not the trauma," Vale said, adjusting his glasses. "It is the choice. That day on Vesta 4, you disobeyed a direct order to save a civilian. You failed, yes, but the intent, the sheer stubborn refusal to accept the logic of sacrifice created a dissonance in your mind. The maw feeds on determinism. You represent chaos, free will. That makes you a unique frequency." "Great," Stanley muttered. "My stubbornness is a superpower." "Or a curse," Alice said softly. She was checking her weapon, a sleek energy pistol that looked too expensive for a freelancer. "Doctor, the exit route, Sector 7, Vale said. Through the waste disposal arteries. It is unglamorous, but the sensors there are minimal." Suddenly the floor beneath them shuddered. A low, grinding sound vibrated through the metal, like rocks being crushed together, deep underground. Alice's ears swiveled toward the door they had just sealed. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what Stanley asked. "Scratching," she said. Her fur stood on end. "Like glass on metal." Vale's face went pale. "The hounds." "I thought you said the antibodies were asleep," Alice accused. "Antibodies are biological," Vale stammered. "Hounds are psionic projections. They hunt the echo of the escape. They track the intent to leave." The heavy blast door buckled. A dent appeared in the center, protruding inward. Then another. The metal groaned. "Run," Alice said. Now they bolted down the service tunnel. Behind them, the door tore open with the screech of tearing steel. Stanley glanced back and wished he hadn't. Pouring into the tunnel were creatures that defied biology. They looked like jagged wolves made of broken mirrors and static. They had no eyes, only snouts that sniffed the air, and where they stepped, the metal floor seemed to gray out and dissolve into dust. "Do not let them touch you," Vale screamed, clutching his datapad to his chest as he ran. "They do not bite flesh. They bite your timeline. If they catch you, you simply cease to have ever existed." "Encouraging," Stanley yelled back. The tunnel ahead ended in a vertical shaft. "Gravity fluctuation detected," the automated system warned. "Jump," Alice commanded. "It is a drop," Stanley argued. "Trust the architecture." She leaped into the empty shaft. Instead of falling, she drifted upward, caught in a distorted gravity well. Stanley grabbed Vale by the collar and jumped. The sensation was nauseating. Down became up. His stomach slammed into his throat. They fell upward through the shaft, passing level after level of pulsating biocells. The hounds scrambled into the shaft below them, their claws digging into the walls, scuttling up with terrifying speed. "They are faster than us," Stanley yelled. The sound of his own voice was muffled, as if he were shouting into a pillow. "Sound dampeners," Alice shouted back. "We are entering the sensory deprivation zone. Keep visual contact." They drifted toward a landing platform on level 40. Alice kicked off the wall spinning in 0G and fired 3 shots from her pistol. The bolts of blue energy hit the leading hound. The creature did not bleed. It shattered like a dropped vase, its shards evaporating into smoke. "Nice shot," Stanley grunted as he grabbed the edge of the platform and hauled himself up. Gravity reasserted itself with a bone-jarring slam. He pulled Vale up after him. They were in a wide observation gallery. On one side, a massive window looked out into the void of the glass maw, a swirling vortex of colorless energy that hurt to look at. On the other side, rows of cells stretched into the distance. But something was wrong. Ahead of them, a prisoner was trapped halfway through a cell wall. The man was screaming, but no sound came out. The biomatter of the prison had turned aggressive. It was flowing over him, thick, translucent ropes of muscle, enveloping his legs and torso. He was being absorbed. "He triggered a defense reflex," Vale said, horrified. "The wall is eating him to reclaim biomass." Alice grabbed Stanley's arm. "Ignore it. We have to keep moving. The hounds are seconds behind us." Stanley looked at the man. He saw the terror in the prisoner's eyes. It was the same look as the child on Vesta 4. The same silent scream. "We can't just leave him," Stanley said. "He is dead already," Alice snapped, pulling him. "If we stop, we all die. That is the math, Stanley. Do not be an idiot." Stanley looked at the exit door 50 meters away. Then he looked at the man. "I am tired of the math," Stanley said. He wrenched his arm free from Alice's grip. He didn't run toward the exit. He ran toward the wall. "Stanley!" Alice shouted, her voice cracking with genuine frustration. Stanley reached the prisoner. The biomatter was hot, pulsing violently. It had reached the man's chest. Stanley grabbed the man's arm and pulled. It was like trying to pull a stone out of setting concrete. "Help me!" Stanley roared, bracing his boots against the slick floor. The prisoner looked at him, shock overriding the pain. "Why," he mouthed. "Because I say so." Stanley gritted his teeth. He channeled every ounce of rage he had held for 10 years. Rage at the command, rage at the unfairness, rage at himself, and poured it into the pull. The wall fought back. Tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Stanley's wrists, stinging like jellyfish. Then a second pair of hands grabbed the prisoner's other arm. Stanley looked up. Alice was there. Her ears were flattened, her teeth bared in a snarl, but she was pulling. "You are the worst investment I have ever made," she hissed. "Pull!" Stanley yelled. Together they heaved. Dr. Vale, hovering nervously nearby, jammed his tuning device into the wall mass and activated a disruption pulse. With a wet tearing sound, the wall relinquished its prize. The prisoner tumbled out, covered in slime, but alive. Stanley fell back, gasping. He expected the hounds to be on them. He expected the walls to crush them. But then silence. The violent red pulsing of the room slowed. The angry heat radiating from the floor cooled. The bioluminescence shifted from crimson to a soft, inquisitive blue. The hounds, which had just crested the edge of the platform, stopped. They sniffed the air, confused. The aggressive signal they were tracking, the scent of fear and conflict, had changed. "What is happening?" Vale whispered. "The resonance," Stanley panted, wiping slime from his hands. "It changed." The wall behind them, the one that had been trying to eat the man, shuddered. It didn't attack. Instead, the muscle fibers retracted, pulling apart to reveal a hidden maintenance chute that was not on any map. The prison was opening a door for them. Alice looked at the new path, then at Stanley. Her golden eyes were wide. "You changed the rules," she murmured. "You acted against survival logic, and the Maw liked it." "Let's not wait for it to change its mind," Stanley said. He helped the shivering prisoner up. "Can you run?" The man nodded frantically. "Yes, yes, thank you." "Go." Stanley pointed to the main exit. "That way leads to the lower holding blocks. Hide there until the cycle ends." The prisoner ran. "We go this way," Stanley said, pointing to the chute the wall had revealed. Alice shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "After you, hero." They slid down the chute just as the hounds shook off their confusion and shrieked, resuming the chase. But the wall snapped shut behind them, sealing the tunnel with a layer of bone-hard armor. They tumbled through the darkness for what felt like miles. Finally, the chute leveled out and dumped them onto a pile of soft ash. Cold wind hit Stanley's face. He scrambled up. They were outside. They stood on a rusted gantry overlooking the ash ring. Below them, the vast, desolate landscape of the prison planet stretched out under a starless sky. The wind howled, carrying the dust of dead civilizations. Behind them, the massive monolithic structure of the bioprison loomed like a dormant beast. Stanley took a deep breath. The air was thin and tasted of sulfur, but it was free air. "We made it," Vale breathed, checking his limbs to make sure he was still in one dimension. Alice stood at the edge of the railing, looking out at the darkness. She turned to Stanley. "You risked the entire escape for a stranger. That was stupid." "Probably," Stanley admitted. "Do it again," she said, her voice serious, "and I might actually start liking you. That would be unprofessional." Stanley leaned against the railing, his adrenaline crashing, leaving him exhausted. "I need a drink, and a shower, in that order." "We need to move," Vale said. "The warden will not let this slide. He will deploy the orbital interceptors." Stanley looked back at the prison one last time. High up on the black surface of the structure, a single vein of blue light pulsed. Thump, 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 thump. It matched the rhythm of his own heart. "You hear that?" Stanley asked. "Hear what?" Alice asked, adjusting her armor. "Nothing," Stanley said, turning away. "Just an echo." But he knew it wasn't an echo. It was a goodbye. Or perhaps an invitation. "Where is the ship?" Stanley asked. "Hidden in the debris field 3 miles north," Alice said. "Better start walking, old man." They began the descent into the ash ring, 3 tiny figures against the backdrop of a broken world. Stanley walked with a limp, but his head was up. For the first time in 10 years, the silence in his head wasn't screaming. It was waiting. The glass maw had let him go, but Stanley had a feeling it hadn't let him go for free. It had let him go because it wanted to see what he would do next. "Alice," Stanley said as they navigated a pile of scrap metal. "What? Thank you." Alice didn't look back, but her tail gave a slight, satisfied flick. "Put it on my tab. I charge interest." Stanley smiled. It was a grim, tired smile, but it was real. He could work with interest. Interest meant there was a future to pay it in. And for a man who had woken up expecting to die, a future was the most dangerous weapon of all. The wind in the ash ring did not just blow, it scraped. It carried microshards of oxidized metal and crystallized atmosphere that felt like millions of invisible needles seeking purchase on exposed skin. It was a place where color went to die, bleeding out into an endless suffocating spectrum of gray and rust. Stanley pulled the collar of his stolen thermal jacket higher, squinting against the grit. The landscape around them was a graveyard of ambition. Massive skeletal hulls of starships, half-buried mining rigs, and shattered orbital platforms lay in disjointed heaps, looking less like wreckage and more like things that had simply forgotten how to be whole. "Keep up, old man," Alice called out, over the howling gale. Her voice was distorted by the rebreather mask she wore, but the mockery was intact. "If you fall behind, I am not carrying you. My contract specifies alive, not comfortable." Stanley adjusted his own mask, his leg aching where the dampeners of the prison suit had chafed. "You keep mentioning this contract," he shouted back. "You realize I have no money right, unless your client accepts payment in bad knees and regrets." Alice stopped near the twisted remains of a docking pylon to check her navigation unit. She looked back at him, her golden eyes narrowing behind her goggles. "The client is the bounty board of the Meridian sector. Standard retrieval. 50,000 credits." Stanley stopped. He laughed, a dry sound that was immediately swallowed by the wind. 50,000. For a washed-out sergeant, that is inflation for you. "The contract has a rider," Alice said, her tone shifting, becoming more clinical. "Subject must be returned with neural architecture intact. No stunning. No sedation that affects REM sleep. They want your mind pristine." "That is polite of them," Stanley muttered, "considering they want to plug it into a wall." "It is polite," Alice agreed, turning back to the path. "Usually they just ask for the head." They trudged on. The ash ring was not just physically eroding, it felt ontologically unstable. Occasionally Stanley would pass a piece of debris, a chair, a bulkhead door that seemed to flicker, turning translucent for a second before solidifying again. It was as if the universe was buffering, struggling to render the reality of this place. "Doctor?" Stanley asked, looking at Rowan Vale, who was stumbling along behind Alice, clutching his satchel of data drives like a newborn child. "Why does this place feel like it is not all here?" Dr. Rowan Vale adjusted his taped glasses, breathless. "Because it isn't. We are on the periphery of the glass maw. The anomaly does not just eat matter. It consumes probability. It eats the what-if. Things here are losing their potential to exist. Eventually, they just stop." "Cheery," Stanley said. "We are close," Alice announced. She pointed toward a jagged silhouette rising from the gray mist about half a mile away. It was a decommissioned medical frigate, its hull cracked open, like an egg, half buried in a dune of metallic sand. "That is the rendezvous point." "Who are we meeting?" Stanley asked. "Another bounty hunter." "A mechanic for bodies," Alice said. "If you are going to be worth 50,000, I need to make sure the prison didn't scramble your brains permanently." The interior of the medical frigate was surprisingly sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The airlock cycled with a groan of protesting hydraulics, sealing out the wind. The silence that followed was heavy smelling of antiseptic and stale coffee. "Hello," Alice called out, her hand hovering near the pistol at her hip. "Put the gun away, Fox," a voice echoed from the shadows of the triage bay. "I just scrubbed these floors. I do not want scorch marks." A woman stepped into the light. She was human, perhaps in her late 50s, with graying hair, tied back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. She wore a stained medical apron over a flight suit. This was Grace Holloway. "Grace," Alice said, relaxing slightly, "I brought you a puzzle." Grace wiped her hands on a rag and looked at Stanley. Her gaze was clinical, dissecting him in seconds. "He looks like he walked out of a grave and forgot to lie back down." "Close enough," Stanley said. "I am Stanley." "Sit," Grace commanded, pointing to a rusted examination table. "I do not care who you are. I care about your vitals." Stanley sat. For the next 20 minutes, Grace worked with a speed and efficiency that betrayed a lifetime of practicing medicine in places where supplies were low and death was high. She scanned him with a handheld bioreader, poked at his bruises, and shone a light into his eyes that felt bright enough to illuminate the back of his skull. When she ran the scanner over his head, she paused. She frowned, tapping the side of the device, then ran it again. "Odd," she murmured. "What is it?" Dr. Vale asked, leaning in eagerly. The resonance. It is not a tumor if that is what you are worried about, Grace said, lowering the scanner. She looked at Stanley with a new intensity. But your neural pathways are vibrating. Not chemically. It is physical. It is like your brain is a tuning fork that someone struck 10 years ago and it never stopped humming. The anchor, Vale whispered. He is a natural anchor. I am a retired soldier, Stanley said, buttoning his shirt. I am not a musical instrument. To the maw you are, Grace said bluntly. She walked over to a console and pulled up a holographic display of Stanley's brain scan. A specific cluster of neurons in the frontal cortex was glowing with a rhythmic golden pulse. This region handles decision-making under stress. Moral arbitration. In most people, it lights up when they choose. In you, it is locked in a permanent state of act. It is like you are perpetually refusing to accept a reality you do not like. That sounds like a personality flaw, Stanley said. In a normal world, yes, Grace agreed. Near the glass maw, it is a shield. Before they could discuss it further, the communications array in the corner of the room crackled to life. It was not a transmission directed at them. It was a wideband broadcast overpowering every frequency in the sector. A face appeared on the main monitor. It was a face Stanley had seen on propaganda posters, but never this close. Warden Rook Sagan. He did not look like a monster. He looked like an accountant who had not slept in a week. His uniform was impeccable, but his eyes were sunken, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. He sat at a simple metal desk, hands clasped. Citizens of the Ring and the Meridian Sector, Sagan began. His voice was calm, terrifyingly reasonable. I am not speaking to threaten. I am speaking to clarify. Alice stiffened, her ears flattening against her skull. There has been a security breach at the containment facility, Sagan continued. A subject has been removed. You may hear him called a prisoner. You may hear him called a victim. These are emotional terms. They are irrelevant. The image on the screen changed to a profile of Stanley. This man is an anchor, Sagan said. The glass maw is not a monster. It is a force of nature. It expands when probability is fractured. It feeds on chaos. To keep it contained, we must feed it certainty. We must feed it a mind that does not waver. One single consciousness to hold the line, so that millions of others can live freely. Sagan leaned forward, staring directly into the camera. I am not a cruel man. I am a man who does the math. One life for one sector. That is the price of your tomorrow. If you see this man, do not approach him as a criminal. Approach him as a lost component of the dam that keeps the flood away. Bring him back. Not for me, but for your children. The transmission cut. The static returned. The room was silent. He makes a compelling argument, Stanley said quietly. He is a fanatic, Dr. Vale argued, his voice rising. He believes that the only way to save the universe is to freeze it, to turn it into a sculpture where nothing ever changes. That is not life. That is a museum. He believes he is right, Grace said, turning off the monitor. That makes him dangerous. Most villains know they are greedy. Rook thinks he is the messiah of calculus. Alice was checking her weapons again, her movements jerky. It does not matter what he thinks. It matters that every scavenger in the ash ring just heard that. We need to move. I have a ship lined up, but we have to cross the debris field to get to it. I need to calibrate the bioscanners, Grace said, throwing supplies into a bag. I am coming with you. Stanley looked at her. You are safe here. Why risk it? Grace slung the bag over her shoulder. I swore an oath to do no harm. Letting a man be turned into a biological doorstop violates that oath. Besides, she patted a heavy-looking pistol on her hip. I hate math. They moved out, 10 minutes later. The wind had died down, which Alice noted was actually worse. In the ash ring, Silence usually meant something was holding its breath. They were navigating a narrow canyon formed by two crashed freighter hulls when the atmosphere changed. It wasn't a sound. It was the death of sound. One moment, Stanley could hear the crunch of his boots on the gravel and the hiss of his rebreather. The next, the world was mute. He stomped his foot, nothing. He clapped his hands. Silence. Then the color began to bleed out of the world. The rusted red of the freighter hull turned a dull gray. The yellow warning stripes on a piece of debris faded to white. Glass silence. Alice's voice did not exist, but he saw her mouth the words. She reacted with a speed that bypassed thought. She grabbed Stanley by the harness of his jacket and hurled him into the shadow of a large overhang. She kicked Dr. Vale behind a slab of concrete and dragged Grace down with her. She pulled a small spherical device from her belt and slammed it into the ground. A shimmering semi-translucent bubble expanded around them. It distorted the light, making everything inside look underwater. Outside the bubble, the world became a black-and-white photograph. Stanley watched in horror as a small, scavenger rodent scurried across the open ground. As the wave of silence passed over it, the creature slowed down. It didn't die. It just faded. Its edges became blurry. Then, it simply wasn't there anymore. It hadn't been vaporized. It had been edited out of existence. Alice was shaking. She was curled in a ball, her hands over her ears, eyes squeezed shut. For a bounty hunter who projected absolute confidence, she looked terrifyingly small. Stanley reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched violently, her eyes snapping open. They were wild, dilated with panic. She looked at him, then at the barrier, breathing hard. She pointed to her chest, then to the barrier, miming a heartbeat. "Stay here. Stay alive." That was when Stanley saw them. About 200 yards away, down in the ravine, a group of figures was huddled against the hull of the freighter. They were outside the effective range of any cover. They were not human. They were crustacean-like beings with thick, chitinous shells and multiple limbs. Refugees. A family. There were 2 large ones shielding 3 smaller ones. They were banging on the sealed airlock of the freighter, screaming silently. The wave of desaturation was moving toward them. The color was draining from the ground at their feet. Stanley looked at the safety of the bubble. Then he looked at the aliens. He didn't think. The resonance point in his brain, that knot of stubborn refusal, flared hot. He stood up. Alice grabbed his wrist. She shook her head furiously. "No, you die." Stanley looked at her. He tapped his chest, then pointed at the refugees. He mouthed one word, "Move." He broke free of her grip and stepped out of the bubble. The silence hit him like a physical weight. It was heavy, oppressive. He couldn't hear his own heartbeat, but he could feel it hammering against his ribs. He ran. He ran into the gray. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones. Not temperature cold, but the cold of non-existence. His hands looked paler. The edges of his vision began to blur. He reached the airlock. The alien father looked at him with compound eyes, full of terror. Stanley didn't have a weapon to blast the door. He didn't have a key. He had his hands. He grabbed the manual override wheel of the airlock. It was rusted shut, fused by years of exposure. He pulled. Nothing happened. The gray wave was 10 feet away. The smallest alien child was already losing color, its bright blue shell turning into the color of old newspaper. "No," Stanley thought. "Not again. I do not leave them." He roared, a sound that existed only in his throat, and threw his entire body weight against the wheel. The muscles in his back screamed. The veins in his neck bulged. "Turn. You simply have to turn." He felt the familiar burn in his mind, the rejection of the impossible. The connection between him and the environment shifted. The rust didn't break. It simply ceased to be a factor. The probability of the door opening shifted from 0% to 100% because he refused to accept 0. With a screech that he felt in his teeth, rather than heard the wheel spun. The airlock hissed and cycled open. "Get in," he signaled. The aliens scrambled inside. Stanley shoved the last child in just as the gray wave washed over his boot. He felt his toes go numb, not like frostbite, but like they were asleep forever. He slammed the inner button. The door sealed. Inside the small airlock, sound rushed back in with a violent pop. The aliens were chattering in a high-pitched series of clicks and whistles, huddled together. Stanley slumped against the wall, gasping for air. He looked at his boot. The leather was gray and brittle, crumbling, like dry toast, but his foot underneath was still there. The airlock cycled open on the other side, leading into the freighter's dark interior. But before they could move, the outer door opened again. Alice stood there. The silence wave had passed. She looked furious. Her fur was bristling her tail, lashing back and forth like a metronome set to a fast tempo. Beside her, Grace was holding a scanner, and Dr. Vale was looking at his data pad with his mouth open. "Are you insane?" Alice shouted, her voice echoing in the confined space. "You ran out of the shield. You could have been erased. Do you have a death wish, or are you just allergic to self-preservation?" Stanley looked at the alien family. The father clicked softly and bowed his head toward Stanley. "They were stuck," Stanley said, his voice raspy. "I unstuck them." "You are cargo," Alice yelled, poking him in the chest. "Valuable, fragile cargo. You do not risk the payload to save strays." "They are not strays," Stanley said, straightening up. He towered over her, though she didn't back down. "And I am not cargo. If being alive means I have to watch people fade away just to keep my own skin intact, then you can take me back to the cell. Because that is not living. That is just waiting." Alice stared at him. Her angry expression wavered. She looked at the alien family, then back at Stanley's gray crumbling boot. She let out a frustrated growl and holstered her weapon. "You are impossible," she muttered. "Humans. You always have to make everything a moral statement." "It is how I remember who I am," Stanley replied quietly. "Actually," Grace interrupted, stepping forward. She held up a small containment vial. Inside, a wisp of swirling pearlescent smoke was trapped. "It is a good thing he is impossible." "What is that?" Alice asked. "A resonance sample," Grace said, a rare smile cracking her stony face. When Stanley forced the door open, when he rejected the silence, the maw reacted. It flinched. It left this behind. Pure crystallized probability. Dr. Vale adjusted his glasses, peering at the vial. "Do you realize what this is? This is raw data on how the maw retreats. With this, we don't just have a theory. We have a key." "A key to what?" Stanley asked. "The choir engine," Vale said, his voice trembling with excitement. "I found references to it in the archives, but I thought it was a myth. It is a structure deep in the maw's center. It was built by the ancients who first tried to contain the anomaly. They didn't use an anchor. They used a harmony, a voluntary synchronization of two incompatible consciousnesses to rewrite the song of the maw." "In English, Doctor," Alice said, crossing her arms. "It means we can close the maw without killing anyone," Vale said. "But we need two people, two different species. Two heartbeats that trust each other enough to beat as one in the center of a chaotic storm." Silence descended on the group again, but this time it wasn't the maw's silence. It was the weight of a new possibility. "We need a ship," Alice said abruptly, breaking the tension. "We have the map. We have the key. Now we just need a ride that won't fall apart in a strong breeze." The ship Alice had lined up was less of a spacecraft and more of a collection of spare parts flying in formation. It was a modified Junker-class hauler, painted a garish combination of neon green and rust. It sat in a hidden hangar bay 3 miles from the medical frigate. "It is named the Rust Bucket," Alice introduced as they boarded. "Fitting," Stanley noted, slapping a bulkhead. A flake of paint drifted down. Getting the engine started took 20 minutes of cursing from Alice, and some percussive maintenance from Stanley. When the thrusters finally flared to life, the whole ship shuddered violently. "Inertial dampeners are at 40%, Alice shouted from the pilot's seat. "Hold on to something solid." Stanley strapped himself into the co-pilot's chair. Grace and Vale secured themselves in the back. "Launching in 3, 2, 1, Alice announced. The ship lurched upward, blasting through the camouflage netting that covered the hangar roof. They shot out into the gray sky of the ash ring engines, screaming. "Bounty hunters inbound," Grace called from the sensor station. "3 interceptors. They are tagging us." "Hang on," Alice said. Her hands flew across the controls. "I am going to try something stupid." "That seems to be the theme of the day," Stanley said. Alice dived the ship into the debris field. They wove between floating hulks of metal, scraping paint against asteroids. The interceptors fired laser blasts, sizzling past their hull, but Alice flew with a chaotic, unpredictable rhythm that made her impossible to track. She banked hard around a spinning turbine, pulled a vertical climb that pinned Stanley to his seat, and punched the sublight drive. The stars stretched into lines. The gray of the ash ring fell behind them. They were clear. An hour later, the ship was drifting in the quiet of deep space, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a dull ache in Stanley's bones. He walked up to the cockpit. Alice was staring out at the curve of the planet, her hand resting on the throttle. He noticed something. Her hand was shaking. It was a fine, rhythmic tremor. "You okay?" Stanley asked softly. Alice jumped slightly. She quickly pulled her hand into her lap. "Fine. Just the adrenaline dump. Flying this heap takes a lot of muscle." Stanley didn't buy it. He had seen soldiers shake like that. It wasn't muscle fatigue. It was the aftershock of terror or memory. "The silence," Stanley said. "Back there on the ground. You reacted before anyone else. You knew what it felt like." Alice didn't look at him. She stared at the swirling clouds of the gas giant. "I grew up near a breach," she said, her voice low. "A long time ago, before I was a hunter. I know what the maw sounds like. It sounds like everything you love going quiet, one by one." She turned the pilot's chair to face him. The snark was gone, replaced by a tired vulnerability she quickly tried to hide. "You are a fool, Stanley," she said. "Going back for those refugees. You risked 50,000 credits. You risked your life. You risked my payout." "And yet," Stanley said, leaning against the doorframe, "you waited. You could have left. You could have taken the ship and flown off while I was playing hero in the airlock." Alice looked down at her boots. "I hate paperwork. Explaining a missing bounty is a nightmare." "Liar," Stanley smiled. Alice looked up. Her golden eyes met his. There was a challenge there, but also a grudging respect. "We have the sample," she said, deflecting. "Vale says the choir engine is in the center of the maw. That is a suicide run, Stanley. Even with the key. Why go? You are free. We could drop you off at a neutral station. You could disappear." Stanley looked at his hands. The hands that had failed to save a child 10 years ago, but had saved a family today. "I spent 10 years running from a mistake," Stanley said. "I am done running. If there is a way to close that thing to stop the silence, I have to try." He paused, then added, "You don't have to come. You can drop us off and go claim another bounty." Alice looked at him for a long moment. She reached out and flipped a switch on the console, engaging the auto-navigation toward the coordinates Vale had deciphered. "I already told you," she said, a small, sharp smile returning to her face. "My contract says I have to deliver you. It didn't specify where." She turned back to the window, but Stanley saw her hand resting on the console. It was steady now. "Besides," she added softly, almost too quiet to hear, "I would like to see a world where the silence doesn't win. Stanley sat in the co-pilot seat watching the stars. He realized then that the warden was wrong. The maw couldn't be fought with a wall. It couldn't be fought with an anchor. It had to be fought with this two broken people in a rusted ship driving straight into the dark, because they decided against all probability that today was not the day they gave up. Saffron Freeport did not look like a space station. It looked like the inside of a geode that had been cracked open and filled with amber fire. Carved deep into the hollowed belly of a drifting nickel-iron asteroid, the market was a vertical labyrinth of suspended walkways, neon-lit docking clamps and shops carved directly into the rock face. The air here was thick-smelling of recycled ozone, exotic spices, and the distinct metallic tang of desperation. The lighting was strictly artificial, a perpetual honey-colored dusk cast by thousands of sodium vapor lamps, strung up like holiday lights. The rust bucket shuddered as it engaged the magnetic locks of a lower-tier docking bay. "Welcome to Saffron," Alice said, flipping the engine shutdown sequence. "Keep your hands on your wallets and your eyes on the exits. People here do not just trade cargo. They trade probabilities." Stanley unbuckled his harness, wincing as his stiff joints protested. "Probabilities, you mean gambling." "I mean futures," Alice corrected. She pulled a heavy cloak over her armor, hiding the distinct silhouette of her bounty hunter gear. "You can buy a weather forecast for a planet 3 systems away. You can buy the mathematical likelihood of a corporation collapsing. If you have enough credits, you can buy a tomorrow where you are rich. If you are poor, you sell your luck just to eat today." "Sounds exhausting," Stanley muttered. "It is capitalism with a metaphysics degree," Dr. Rowan Vale added, clutching his satchel. "And it is the only place in the sector where we might find a singing glass without alerting the warden's network immediately." They disembarked into the humidity of the docks. The crowd was a riot of species and colors. Heavy worlders with gravity braces lumbered past nimble insectoid traders. Drones buzzed overhead, projecting holographic advertisements for certified fate-free water and guaranteed safe hyperlanes. Alice led them with practiced ease, weaving through the crush. She stopped in front of a booth that looked like a repurposed engine turbine. Inside, a man with blue skin and 4 arms was juggling datapads. "Jax!" Alice barked. The man froze, dropping one pad, which he caught deftly with a lower hand. He looked up, a grin spreading across his face that revealed too many teeth. "Alice!" Jax Muir exclaimed. His voice was melodic, like a flute being played by a con artist. "My favorite fox. I heard you were dead. Then I heard you were rich. Then I heard you were dead again. I am glad the rumors are so inconsistent." "I need information, Jax," Alice said, leaning over the counter. "And I need it quiet." Jax's eyes darted to Stanley, then to Grace and Vale. "You bring a circus, a soldier who walks like he is carrying the sky, a doctor who smells like antiseptic and judgment, and is that a professor?" "We are tourists," Stanley said flatly. "Of course," Jax winked. "And I am a legitimate businessman. Look, Alice, you are hot property right now, but not in the good way." Jax tapped a command on his console. A holographic projection flared to life above the counter. It was a replica of the bounty board, the sector-wide list of targets. Stanley's face was right at the top. The sum underneath his image was written in flashing red letters: 2 million credits. 2 million, Stanley choked. "It was 50,000 yesterday." "Inflation is a killer," Jax said. "But look at the fine print." He expanded the text. Underneath the reward there was a specific set of instructions. Subject must be returned with neural resonance patterns undisturbed. Any damage to the frontal cortex or emotional regulation centers voids the contract and will result in the termination of the hunter. "They do not just want you alive," Dr. Vale whispered, adjusting his taped glasses. "They want the instrument tuned. Whoever posted this knows exactly what Stanley is. They know about the maw." "The warden," Grace said, her hand resting on her pistol. He is outsourcing the hunt. Exactly, Jack said. Every hunter from here to the rim is looking for a human veteran with a bad attitude. You are walking around with a target the size of a moon on your back. We need a singing glass, Alice said, ignoring the bounty. And we need a map to the core. Jax whistled, low. High stakes. You want to navigate the maw that is suicide. But I might know a guy. He deals in artifacts salvaged from the event horizon. He is in the Undercity, Sector 4. Thanks, Jax, Alice said, turning to leave. Alice, Jax called out. She stopped. If you turn him in, you can retire to a private moon. Why are you running with the package? Alice looked at Stanley. For a second, the snarky mask slipped, revealing something tired and protective. Because he is not a package, Jax. He is a nuisance. And I hate unfinished arguments. Jax laughed. Good luck, Fox. Try not to die. It is bad for my commission rates. The group split up. It was a tactical risk, but a necessary one. Grace insisted on stopping at a makeshift clinic in the refugee quarter, while Alice, Stanley, and Vale went to find the artifact dealer. We have 2 hours, Alice warned Grace. If you are not at the rendezvous point, we leave. Grace looked at the line of beings waiting outside the clinic. People with radiation burns, people missing limbs, people fading from exposure to the maw's edges. I will be there, but I am not walking past this. Stanley watched Grace go. She is a good woman. She is a liability, Alice grunted, though there was no heat in her voice. Come on, the Undercity is this way. Sector 4 was darker, the amber lights dimmer and flickering. The walkways here were rusted, vibrating with the hum of the station's massive atmospheric recyclers. They found the shop tucked behind a curtain of steam venting from a broken pipe. The sign simply read, Echoes. The proprietor was a small, shriveled creature that looked like a tortoise without a shell, floating in a tank of nutrient fluid. A mechanical arm extended from the tank to interact with the world. A singing glass, the creature's synthesized voice buzzed. Rare, illegal, dangerous. We have credits, Vale said, stepping forward. Credits are paper, the creature scoffed. Credits buy bread. Credits buy fuel. Credits do not buy the crystallized heartbeat of a dimensional anomaly. For that, I want something real. What do you want? Stanley asked. A memory, the creature said. The mechanical arm pointed a lens at Dr. Vale. You understand the math of the maw. You have stared into it. I collect perspectives. I want a memory of pure intellectual discovery. The moment you realized the universe was bigger than your equations, Vale froze. You want to extract it. Copy it, the creature corrected. But the process takes the emotional weight. You will remember the fact, but you will lose the feeling. It will be like reading a biography of yourself. Rowan, no, Stanley said, stepping in front of the doctor. That is too high a price. Your memories are who you are. We need the glass, Vale said softly. He looked at his hands. Stanley, you faced a firing squad of biomatter for us. Grace is risking capture to heal strangers. I am just a decoder. Let me pay my share. Vale stepped up to the interface console attached to the tank. Do it. The machine whirred. A probe attached to Vale's temple. The doctor gasped, his eyes rolling back. For 10 agonizing seconds, the machine hummed with a high-pitched whine. Then it stopped. Vale slumped against the counter, breathing hard. He looked older, smaller. It is done, the creature said. A small drawer popped open. Inside lay a jagged shard of crystal. It was not clear. It shifted colors, constantly pulsing, with a faint internal rhythm. Vale picked it up. He looked at it without joy. I remember discovering the syntax of the Maw's language. I remember it was the happiest day of my life, but... He frowned. I cannot feel it. It is just data now, like knowing the boiling point of water. Stanley put a hand on Vale's shoulder. The grip was firm grounding. "You did not just buy a rock, Rowan. You bought us a chance. I owe you a tomorrow for this." Vale looked up, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. "I will calculate the interest, Stanley. Do not be late with the payments." They left the shop, the singing glass, wrapped carefully in cloth. As they walked back toward the main thoroughfare, the station's ambient noise seemed to swell. Suddenly, Alice stumbled. It was subtle at first, a misstep, a hand bracing against the wall. Then she stopped completely. Her ears flattened against her skull. Her eyes went wide, the pupils dilating until the gold was almost swallowed by black. "Alice?" Stanley asked. She didn't answer. Her mouth opened, and a sound came out that was not her voice. It was a multi-tonal chord, a vibration that sounded exactly like the hum of the prison cell. "Cora v. Asylum Breach." The words were not in any language Stanley recognized, but they felt heavy, archaic. Stanley grabbed her shoulders. "Alice, look at me!" She blinked, shaking her head, violently, as if trying to dislodge water from her ears. The black receded from her eyes. She looked at Stanley, terror flashing across her face for a split second before she walled it off. "I am fine," she snapped, pulling away. "Just atmospheric pressure. My inner ear is sensitive." "That was not pressure," Stanley said quietly. "You spoke in the old tongue. The language Vale is studying." "I speak 5 languages," Alice deflected, forcing a grin that looked painful. "Sometimes I get them mixed up when I am hungry. Are we getting food? I could kill for a protein bar." Stanley looked at her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she refused to meet his gaze. She was using humor as a shield, a flak jacket to stop him from seeing the damage underneath. He didn't push. He knew what it was like to hold a broken piece of yourself together with duct tape and stubbornness. "Protein bars later," Stanley said. "Let's find Grace." They found Grace exactly where she said she would be, but the situation had complicated. The clinic was closing up, but Grace was huddled in a corner with a hooded figure. "We have the glass," Stanley said as they approached. Grace looked up, her face grim but triumphant. "And I have the map, or at least the instructions." She gestured to the hooded figure. It was a deserter, a former soldier of the Warden's Guard who had fled the maw. "The choir engine," the deserter whispered, his voice raspy. "It is not just a machine. It is a lock. To open the path to the core, you need the crystal, yes. But you need to activate it." "How?" Vale asked, holding the cloth-wrapped shard. "Resonance," the deserter said. "The engine requires a dual input to prove that the universe is worth saving. It demands a memory of pure compassion from a species that knows war." He pointed a trembling finger at Stanley. "That is you." "And?" Alice asked. "And it demands a heartbeat," the deserter continued. "The heartbeat of a species that hunts. A predator that chooses not to bite. A vulpiri." Alice went still. It has to be synchronous," the deserter warned. "If the memory is false, or if the heartbeat falters from fear, the engine will treat you as a virus. It will purge you." Alice looked at Stanley. "So I just have to keep my heart steady while you get emotional sounds easy. I have ice water in my veins." "You were shaking 10 minutes ago," Stanley said softly. "Low blood sugar," Alice shot back instantly. "Let's go. We have the pieces. We need to get back to the ship before—" A siren wailed. It wasn't the station's standard alarm. It was a sharp, piercing shriek that cut through the noise of the market. The amber lights turned a harsh, flashing crimson. "Bounty enforcement!" Jax's voice crackled over the public address system, sounding strained. "Alice, you have company. Sector 4 is locked down. They are not local." "The Warden found us," Grace said, drawing her weapon. From the walkways above, figures descended. They were not the ragtag bounty hunters of the Freeport. They were clad in sleek, matte black armor with no insignias. They moved with military precision, rappelling down on silent lines. Targets acquired, a mechanical voice amplified over the crowd. Secure the anchor. Terminate the accomplices. Minimize collateral damage to the asset. They mean you, Stanley, Alice said, drawing her pistol. They are going to try to bag you and kill us. Run! Stanley shouted to the civilians in the market square. The squad opened fire. Bolts of plasma scorched the air. The crowd panicked, a stampede of screaming traders and refugees. Stanley grabbed a heavy metal table from a nearby food stall and flipped it, creating a barricade. Get down! Grace and Vale dove behind the cover. Alice vaulted over it, firing 2 precise shots that took out a drone hovering above them. We are pinned! Alice yelled. There are snipers on the upper gantry. Stanley looked around. The market was a kill box. The warden's team had the high ground. They were firing controlled bursts, careful not to hit Stanley, but suppressing everyone else. To their left, a group of saffron locals were trapped behind a crate of fruit. A mother and child were exposed. A sniper laser dotted the mother's chest. They are just in the way, one of the black-clad soldiers shouted. Clear the line of fire. Stanley saw the soldier raise a grenade launcher. If Stanley did nothing, the soldier would fire. The civilians would die. But the path to the docks would be open in the chaos. If Stanley acted, he would expose himself. The resonance point in his head slammed against his skull. The choice was not a choice. It was a reflex. Cover me! Stanley roared. Stanley, no! Alice screamed. Stanley broke cover. He didn't run away. He ran toward the civilians. He moved with the surprising speed of a man who had survived 100 battlefields. He slid across the floor, grabbing a discarded kinetic shield generator from a fallen guard. He slammed it down in front of the mother and child just as the grenade launcher fired. Boom! The explosion washed over the shield. The force of it knocked Stanley backward, slamming him into a support pillar. His ears rang. His vision swam. But the mother and child were alive. The smoke cleared. Stanley stood up, shaky, shielding the civilians with his own body. He looked up at the black-clad soldiers. Is that all you have got? He bellowed. You want the anchor? Here I am. Come and get me. The black-clad captain paused. He is protecting them. Use it. Flank him. But the shot never came. From the shadows of the upper walkways, a new sound erupted. It was the distinct crack of slug throwers and the hiss of makeshift energy weapons. The locals, the traders, the smugglers. Jax Muir stood on a balcony holding a rifle that was almost as big as he was. Hey, black suits nobody blows up my fruit stand. A barrage of fire from the saffron locals rained down on the warden's team. The market had turned. They weren't fighting for Stanley. They were fighting because Stanley had protected one of their own when he could have run. The enemy of my enemy is the guy who didn't kill my customers, Jax yelled. Alice, get to the ship. We will hold the door. Go! Grace shouted, pulling Stanley toward the docking bay. Alice covered their retreat, her pistol flashing. She looked at Stanley, bruised, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but moving with a grim determination. She had seen many soldiers. She had seen many heroes. Most of them were arrogant. Most of them fought for glory. Stanley fought like he was apologizing to the universe. For the first time, Alice didn't see a bounty. She didn't see a paycheck. She saw a man who was arguably the strongest thing in the room, not because he could punch through a wall, but because he refused to let the wall crush anyone else. Move it, old man, she yelled, but she stayed right beside him, her shoulder brushing his. They burst into the docking bay. The rust bucket was humming engines, prepped. Vale, get on the comms, Alice ordered. Grace, check Stanley. They scrambled aboard. The ramp hissed shut just as a plasma bolt scorched the paint where they had been standing. Punch it! Stanley yelled from the co-pilot seat. Alice slammed the throttle forward. The ship tore free of the magnetic clamps, spinning out of the dock and blasting into the asteroid field. Behind them, Saffron Freeport faded into a speck of amber light against the stars. 2 hours later, deep in the silence of warp space, the ship was quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the drive core. Stanley sat in the mess hall, holding an ice pack to his head. Grace had patched him up, but the headache was a persistent hammer. Alice walked in. She had shed her armor, wearing a simple flight suit. She looked smaller without the gear, but her eyes were still sharp. She held 2 mugs of synthetic coffee. She slid one across the table to him. "You are an idiot," she said. "I know." Stanley took a sip. It tasted like burnt copper. "It is a recurring theme." "You could have died back there," Alice said. She sat down opposite him. "You protected people you didn't know. People who would have sold you out for a ticket off the rock." "Maybe," Stanley said. "But if I let them die, then the warden is right. If I let them die to save myself, then survival is just a calculation. And I am tired of being part of an equation." Alice stared into her coffee. Her tail curled around the leg of her chair. "The deserter," she said softly. "He said the engine needs a memory of compassion, and a heartbeat that chooses not to bite." "I heard him," Stanley said. "I do not know if I can do it," Alice admitted. It was the first time she had said it out loud without a joke attached. "The maw messed with my head in the Freeport. I have holes in my memory, Stanley. Big ones. What if I am broken? What if I get to the engine and I can't sink?" Stanley reached across the table. He didn't touch her hand, but he rested his fingers near hers. "You came back for me in the prison," Stanley said. "You fought for us in the market. You are not broken, Alice. You are just scared. We all are." Alice looked up at him. Her golden eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. She didn't find one. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we actually close the maw and we survive, what then? You are a wanted man. I am a failed hunter. Where do we go?" Stanley looked out the viewport at the streaking stars. "I do not know," he said. "But I know how I want to live." "How?" Alice asked. Stanley looked back at her. "I want to live without looking over my shoulder. I want to live knowing that when I sleep, I didn't leave anyone behind in the dark. Not the kid on Vesta 4, not the refugees in the ring, and not you." Alice went quiet. A flush of color appeared under the fur on her cheeks. She took a long drink of her coffee to hide her face. "Leaving no one behind," she murmured. "That is a terrible business model for a bounty hunter." "Good thing you are not a bounty hunter anymore," Stanley said. "You are a partner." Alice put the mug down. She looked at the singing glass, which sat on the table between them, pulsing with its soft, impossible rhythm. "Partner," she tested the word. It sounded strange in her mouth. "Fine, but I am still driving. You crash everything you touch." "Deal." Stanley smiled. The ship hurled on through the dark, carrying 4 people, a piece of crystallized time, and a fragile, growing hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the end of the world was optional. The approach to the choir engine was not a flight. It was a descent into a cathedral of silence. The rust bucket shuddered as it passed through the outer atmospheric membrane of the anomaly's core, the metal groaning under gravitational tides that defied standard physics. Alice fought the controls, her knuckles white. "Gravity shear is at 300%. Inertial dampeners are failing. We are falling, not flying." "Aim for the spire!" Dr. Rowan Vale shouted from the navigation station, clutching the console as if it were a life raft. "The signal is strongest there. The geometry it is inviting us in." Below them, emerging from the swirling gray mist of the event horizon, was the choir engine. It did not look like a machine built by hands. It looked like a ribcage the size of a city, constructed from a pale, iridescent alloy that curved and twisted like whalebone. Spires of white metal rose into the void, not pointing up, but pointing inward, focusing on a central point of emptiness. The light here behaved incorrectly. It did not radiate. It flowed backward, sucked from the stars, into the structure, creating a sensation that the building was inhaling the universe. "Touchdown in 10 seconds," Alice gritted out. "Brace for impact." The ship slammed onto a landing platform that felt less like metal and more like polished ivory. The landing struts compressed with a screech, and the vessel slid 10 meters before coming to a halt. Silence reclaimed the cabin. Stanley unbuckled his harness. He felt heavy not just from the gravity, but from the pressure of the place. It felt like standing in a courtroom where the judge was gravity itself. "Atmosphere is breathable," Grace Holloway announced, checking her scanner. "But the probability density outside is fluctuating. Don't wander off. You might walk into a future that doesn't exist yet." They disembarked. The scale of the choir engine was terrifying. The columns that held up the vaulted ceiling were thick enough to house skyscrapers. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and petrichor, the scent of rain on dry earth, despite there being no rain and no earth. "It is a church," Stanley whispered, looking up at the arches that twisted into impossible shapes. "It is a tuning fork," Dr. Vale corrected, his voice hushed with reverence. He walked toward a central dais, his eyes wide behind his taped glasses. "Look at the floor. It is not decorative. It is circuitry." The floor was inlaid with veins of gold and silver light that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. Thump, 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 thump. "It is waiting for an input," Vale said. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the singing glass they had bought at Saffron Freeport. The crystal shard was glowing violently now, vibrating in his hand. "How do we turn it on?" Alice asked, her hand resting on her holster. She was scanning the shadows, her ears swiveling nervously. "I do not see an on switch. This structure predates the concept of binary command," Vale explained, stepping onto the dais. "It does not operate on or off. It operates on resonance. It is an empathetic machine." As Vale placed the singing glass into a receptacle, in the center of the dais, the air around them shifted. The ambient hum spiked. Grace suddenly gasped, dropping to one knee. "Grace!" Stanley moved to help her, but he stopped. The air around Grace had turned thick, like solidified gelatin. She was struggling to breathe, but not because of a lack of oxygen. She looked at her hands. "I cannot move my fingers," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "I want to close my fist, but the option is not there." The defense mechanism, Vale realized, looking at his readings. The engine protects itself by limiting variables. It is stripping away our ability to make choices. It perceives us as chaos. "Fix it!" Alice yelled, trying to step toward Grace, but finding her own legs heavy, as if the concept of walking forward was being deleted from her mind. Grace looked at the medical kit strapped to her thigh. Inside was the resonance sample, the wisp of crystallized probability they had collected when Stanley saved the refugees. "It needs a shield," Grace gritted out. "It needs to know we are not chaos." She looked at her medical scanner, her lifeline, the tool she had used to save hundreds of lives. It was interfering with the resonance sample's signal. The metal casing was blocking the frequency. "Grace, what are you doing?" Stanley asked, fighting the invisible weight pressing on his mind. "I am making a choice," Grace said. "While I still can." She grabbed the expensive, irreplaceable medical scanner and smashed it against the hard floor. It shattered. She pulled the vial of resonance smoke from her kit and crushed it in her bare hand. The pearlescent smoke exploded outward, not dissipating but expanding into a thin, shimmering dome around them. The weight lifted instantly. The air became clear. Grace knelt amidst the wreckage of her equipment, her hand bleeding slightly from the glass. She didn't look at the wound. She looked at the group. "We have a bubble," she said, her voice steady. "But I cannot patch anyone up anymore. If you get shot, you stay shot." "That was your livelihood," Alice said softly. "It was a tool," Grace replied, standing up. "You are the patients, priority triage. Dr. Vale turned back to the console. The singing glass had accepted the signal from Grace's sacrifice. The veins in the floor lit up, running from the dais to two raised platforms on either side of the room. "It is awake," Vale said. "It is ready for the trial." He pointed to the left platform. "The anchor goes there. It needs the memory of the refusal." He pointed to the right platform. "The catalyst goes there. It needs the heartbeat of the hunter." Stanley walked toward the left platform. He didn't hesitate. He could feel the machine watching him, not with eyes but with a deep, intrusive curiosity. "Stanley!" Alice called out. He stopped and looked back. "Don't get lost in there," she said. Her voice was light, but her tail was wrapped tight around her leg. "I am just going to have a conversation," Stanley said. "I will be right back." He stepped onto the platform. The world dissolved. Stanley was no longer in the choir engine. He was back on Vesta 4. The heat was unbearable. The sky was choking with black smoke. The sound of artillery was a constant rhythmic thudding that shook the ground beneath his boots. He knew this moment. He had lived it every night for 10 years. He was standing at the intersection. To his left was the extraction point where the dropship was waiting. To his right was the collapsing tenement building. The comms in his ear crackled. "Sergeant, pull back. That is a direct order. The structural integrity is 0. In his memory, he had hesitated. He had argued. He had wasted 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds, the building had fallen. But this was not just a memory. It was a test. The engine was asking him, what if you could choose again? The scenario shifted. The path to the dropship became golden, inviting. The path to the building became dark, terrifying. A voice, the voice of the engine, echoed in his skull. "You can save yourself. You can have a life where you do not wake up screaming. Just turn left." Stanley looked at the golden path. It was peace. It was forgiveness. It was the end of the pain. Then he looked at the building. He saw the child in the window, the fear. Stanley closed his eyes. He felt the phantom heat on his face. "No," he whispered. "You will fail," the engine whispered. "You know the outcome. The child dies. You are disgraced. You lose everything." "I know," Stanley said. He opened his eyes. They were hard, dry, and absolutely certain. "But I will not run. I did not run then. I will not run now. The outcome does not change the duty." He stepped toward the building. He stepped into the fire. The vision shattered. Stanley gasped, falling to his knees on the platform. The white columns of the choir engine returned. He was shaking sweat, dripping from his nose, but the circle of light beneath him had turned a brilliant, solid blue. "Accepted," Dr. Vale breathed. It accepted the resonance. It didn't want a hero. It wanted a constant. All eyes turned to Alice. She stood by the right platform. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive alien architecture. She was rubbing her hands together, a nervous tick she couldn't suppress. "Okay," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "My turn. Do I just stand there and look pretty?" "You need to sync," Vale said. "Place your hand on the interface. Let it read your cardiac rhythm. It needs to match the frequency of the anchor. It needs to prove that a predator can choose to protect." Alice stepped up. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the glowing panel. "I have a right to refuse this, you know," she said, glancing at Stanley. "I didn't sign any consent forms for intimate biological data sharing. This is a privacy violation." "I didn't sign anything either," Stanley said, his voice rough but gentle. "Just breathe, Alice. It is just a heartbeat." "Right," Alice muttered. "Just a heartbeat." She slammed her hand down on the panel. A pulse of red light shot through the floor. The machine hummed a low, dissonant sound. Alice winced. She looked like she was in pain. "Error," the engine's vibration seemed to say. "Signal hollow, source corrupted." Alice tried to pull her hand away, but the interface held her. Her eyes went wide. "It doesn't like me," she panicked. "It says I am empty. It says there is a gap." "What?" Vale checked the console. "There is a discontinuity in your mnemonic engrams, a missing block of time. The engine cannot verify your intent because part of your history is missing." "I told you," Alice yelled, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. "I told you I have holes. I am not real. I am just a broken hunter with a gap in her head where a person should be." She struggled, her breathing becoming erratic. The red light pulsed faster, turning angry. The engine was rejecting her. It was interpreting her memory gap as deception. "Alice!" Stanley shouted. He tried to leave his platform, but the blue light held him in place. "Alice, look at me!" "I cannot do it," she cried. "I am a fraud, Stanley. I don't know who I was before the bounty board. Maybe I am a monster. Maybe the engine knows I am bad." "You are not a monster!" Stanley roared. His voice echoed through the vast chamber, overpowering the hum of the machine. "I do not care about your past. I care about Saffron Freeport. I care about the prison cell you came back. That is who you are." Alice looked at him, her chest heaving. "If you are scared, we take it slow," Stanley said, lowering his voice. "But do not call yourself fake. You are the most real thing I have met in 10 years. Alice stared at him. The panic in her eyes slowly receded, replaced by a fierce trembling focus. She looked at her hand on the panel. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She closed her eyes. She stopped trying to force the machine to read a history she didn't have. Instead, she focused on the present. She focused on the feeling of Stanley's hand on her shoulder in the ship. She focused on the anger she felt when the sniper targeted the child. She focused on the choice. The red light flickered. It turned purple. Then, slowly, it shifted into a deep, warm gold. Synchronization complete. The two beams of light, Stanley's blue and Alice's gold, shot toward the ceiling. They intertwined, spiraling around each other like a strand of DNA, and struck the central spire. The room exploded with light. The walls of the choir engine seemed to dissolve. Suddenly they weren't looking at a wall. They were looking through the machine into the heart of the glass maw. It was terrifying. It was a vortex of mirrors. Millions of them. In each mirror was a different version of the universe. In one, the ship had crashed. In one, Grace had died. In one, Stanley had never left the cell. And in the center of the vortex was a mouth, a vast, colorless void that was eating the mirrors. Every time it swallowed one, a possibility vanished from existence. "It is eating the future," Vale whispered, horrified. "It collapses the wave function. If it expands, there will be no choices left. Only one timeline, the timeline where it wins." "A perfect order," a voice spoke from the entrance of the chamber. "A universe without chaos, without pain." They spun around. Warden Rook Sagan stood there. He was not alone. Behind him were 24 of his elite guard, their weapons raised. But Sagan did not look triumphant. He looked exhausted. He had removed his cap, holding it in his hands like a man attending a funeral. "Warden," Stanley said. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood on the platform, the blue light glowing around him. "You have seen it now," Sagan said, walking slowly toward the dais. "The glass maw. You see what it does. It consumes uncertainty." "It consumes freedom," Stanley corrected. "Freedom is messy," Sagan said. "Freedom is the child dying in the rubble because a soldier hesitated. Freedom is the famine in the Outer Rim because a politician gambled on grain futures. The maw offers certainty. If we control it, if we feed it an anchor, we can prune the timeline. We can cut out the tragedies. We can ensure survival." He looked at Stanley with eyes that were pleading, not commanding. "I am not a villain, Stanley. I am a man who is willing to be hated to save everyone else. If I let the maw run free, it might eat everything. If I cage it with you, I save the sector. One life for billions. It is the lesser evil. Stanley looked at the swirling vortex of the maw. He saw the logic. It was the same logic that had ordered him to retreat on Vesta 4. Cut your losses. Save what you can. You are assuming you have the right to do the math, Stanley said. Someone has to, Sagan replied, or chaos wins. You are scared, Stanley said. You are scared of a world you cannot control, so you want to freeze it. You want to kill the future just to make sure it doesn't hurt you. I want to ensure there is a future, Sagan snapped his composure, cracking for the first time. A future where we have no choice is not a future, Stanley said. It is a script, and I am done reading lines. Then you leave me no choice, Sagan said. He put his cap back on. The mask of the warden returned. Secure the anchor. Terminate the others. Rowan, Stanley yelled. Do it now. I am trying, Vale shouted, his hands flying across the console. I need to engage the dual conduit. It is a complex harmonic. Fire, Sagan ordered. The guards opened fire, but the choir engine was awake now. It was no longer a passive observer. As the plasma bolts streaked across the room, the gravity in the chamber shifted violently. Down became left. The guards stumbled, falling sideways as the floor effectively became a wall. The plasma bolts curved in midair, drawn into the gravity well of the central spire, and swallowed by the light. The engine is protecting the connection, Vale screamed, hanging onto the console, which was now sideways. Defensive positions, Alice yelled. She kicked off a pillar, using the altered gravity to launch herself across the room. She fired her energy pistol, not at the guards but at the floor beneath them, shattering the tiles and creating debris cover. Stanley couldn't move. He was locked in the blue beam. He was the anchor of the reality they were trying to build. I can't fight, Stanley shouted. Alice, keep them off Vale. I am a little busy defying physics, Alice shouted back, spinning in midair to dodge a suppression grenade. The grenade exploded, but there was no sound. The maw swallowed the noise. The silence was disorienting. Sagan was moving toward the dais. He moved with a grim determination, using magnetic boots to stick to the shifting floor. He wasn't firing. He was coming for Stanley. Grace, armed only with a small stun baton she had scavenged, stepped in his path. Move, Doctor, Sagan said. I do not want to kill a healer. I am not healing today, Grace said. She swung the baton. Sagan caught her wrist effortlessly. He was a trained combatant. She was a field medic. He twisted her arm, and she dropped the weapon with a cry of pain. He shoved her aside, sending her sliding down the inclined floor. Stanley, Sagan shouted, pulling a neural dampener from his belt. It ends now. Submit and your friends live. Stanley looked at Sagan. He looked at Alice, who was pinned down by 3 guards. He looked at Vale, who was frantically trying to align the final sequence. Rowan, Stanley asked. Almost, Vale muttered. The frequencies are fighting. I need a bridge. Alice, Stanley yelled. The bridge focus. Alice heard him. She was bleeding from a graze on her arm. She looked at Stanley. Trust. She closed her eyes again, ignoring the laser fire, ignoring the guards. She poured everything she had into the gold light. She poured her fear, her unknown past, her snarky jokes, and her desperate need to be real. The gold beam flared brighter than a sun. It slammed into Stanley's blue beam. The 2 lights merged. They didn't just mix. They became a new color, a color that didn't have a name, something between starlight and blood. The dual conduit locked. The choir engine let out a sound, a massive, resonant chord that shook the very atoms of the room. Boom! The shockwave knocked everyone down. The guards, the warden, Alice, Grace. The gate to the maw opened. It wasn't a vortex anymore. It was a tunnel. A stable, calm path through the chaos. It is open! Vale screamed, his voice cracking. The window is narrow. The probability collapse is stabilized for 3 minutes. We have to go now. Stanley broke free of the beam. The connection remained tethered to him and Alice wirelessly, now a hum in the back of their skulls. Alice, Grace, row and go, Stanley ordered. Alice scrambled up, grabbing Grace. They ran toward the opening in the central spire. Sagan stood up. He looked at the stable tunnel. He looked at the maw, which was no longer eating the future, but waiting. Confusion washed over his face. Impossible, he whispered. You cannot stabilize chaos with emotion. The math says it should collapse. Your math was missing a variable, Stanley said, stepping off the dais. Hope. Stanley ran. He grabbed Vale by the collar and hauled him toward the gate. Stop them! Sagan roared, shaking off his shock. If they enter the core, they could unravel the containment field entirely. The guards scrambled to pursue, but the engine was done with intruders. The floor rippled, creating waves of stone that blocked their path. Only Sagan, with his intimate knowledge of the anomaly's tech, managed to bypass the obstacles. He vaulted over a rising pillar and sprinted after them. Stanley pushed Alice and Grace through the gate. He shoved Vale in after them. He paused at the threshold. He looked back. Sagan was 10 meters away. He had stopped running. He raised his weapon, aiming directly at Stanley's chest. Do not do it, Stanley, Sagan said. His hand was shaking. If you go in there, you change everything. You risk the universe on a gamble. I risk it on a choice, Stanley said. He looked Sagan in the eye. Come with us, Stanley said. Sagan blinked. What? Come and see, Stanley said. See that you were wrong. See that you don't have to be the jailer. For a second, the gun lowered. For a second, the warden looked like a man who desperately wanted to put the burden down. Then the fear returned. The years of indoctrination. The belief that he was the only adult in a room of children. I cannot, Sagan whispered. He raised the gun. Stanley didn't wait. He stepped backward into the light. The shot fired. It scorched the air where Stanley had stood a millisecond before. The gate slammed shut behind him. Sagan stood alone in the silent, massive cathedral of the choir engine. The golden and blue lights were fading, pulsating, with a rhythm that felt mocking. He lowered his gun. He walked to the gate and placed his hand on the cold metal. You fool, he whispered, but there was no anger in his voice, only a terrible creeping dread that perhaps the fool was the one holding the gun. Inside the tunnel, the group tumbled onto a surface that felt like solid light. Is everyone alive? Stanley gasped, checking his limbs. Alive, Alice groaned, holding her arm, and really, really annoyed at gravity. We are in, Vale said, looking around. The tunnel stretched endlessly, lined with the memories of 1,000 worlds. This is the throat of the maw. The core is ahead. Stanley looked at Alice. The golden light was still faintly visible around her, reacting to his blue aura. You did it, Stanley said. You held the bridge. Alice looked at him. She didn't make a joke. She didn't deflect. I didn't do it for the universe, she said softly. I did it because you yelled at me. Whatever works, Stanley smiled weakly. We are not done, Grace said, pointing ahead. Look. At the end of the tunnel, a massive fractured mirror hung in the void. It was cracked in the middle, and from the crack, a dark, viscous silence was leaking out. The source, Vale said. That is where we close it, or where we break. Stanley stood up. He offered a hand to Alice. Ready to finish the contract, he asked. Alice took his hand. Her grip was strong. Let's go get paid, she said. They walked toward the crack in the world too, heartbeats sinking in the dark, leaving the logic of the warden far behind. The center of the glass maw was not a void as the scientists had theorized. It was a mirror, or rather it was millions of mirrors suspended in a gravityless ocean of white static. They were jagged floating shards the size of continents, rotating slowly in the crushing silence. As Stanley, Alice Grace, and Dr. Vale drifted from the tunnel of light into the core, they saw the horror of what the anomaly truly did. It did not destroy matter. It cannibalized possibility. Stanley floated past a shard that was 10 miles wide. On its surface, he saw a reflection of himself. But in this reflection, he was not wearing the battered flight suit of a fugitive. He was wearing the dress uniform of a fleet admiral. He was old gray and standing on a balcony, overlooking a burning city. He looked miserable. "Do not look at them," Dr. Rowan Vale's voice crackled over the comms, though the sound seemed to come from inside their skulls rather than their earpieces. "Those are the might-have-beens. The maw captures every choice you did not make, spins it into a reality, and then shatters it. It feeds on the energy of the collapse." "It is an execution chamber for dreams," Grace Holloway whispered. She was drifting near Vale, her hand clutching the empty vial that had once held the resonance sample. "It is a graveyard," Alice said. She was close to Stanley, her tail twitching in the zero-gravity environment. "And we are walking on the tombstones." The core was bright, a blinding, sterile white that offered no shadows to hide in. In the center of this storm of glass lay the throat. It was a perfect sphere of absolute darkness, pulsating with a rhythm that made Stanley's teeth ache. It was sucking the shards in one by one. Every time a shard hit the sphere, it vanished with a sound like a violin string, snapping, erasing that potential timeline forever. "We are here," Stanley said. "The source." Suddenly the white static turned crimson. The mirrors around them shifted. Instead of showing random possibilities, they all synchronized. Every single shard, millions of them, showed the same image: Stanley strapped to a chair, his eyes burning with golden light, screaming silently as he held the universe together. The voice of Warden Rook-Sagan boomed through the core. It wasn't just audio. It was a vibration that shook the fabric of the dimension. "You see the inevitable, Stanley," Sagan's voice said. "The maw is hungry. It needs an anchor. If you do not give it one, it will take everyone." "He is overriding the choir engine remotely," Vale shouted frantically, tapping on his datapad. "He is using the prison's neural linkage to force a connection. He is trying to turn the entire core into a containment cell." "Can you stop him?" Alice yelled. "I cannot fight the prison's main processor with a handheld scanner," Vale replied. "He is rewriting the physics of the room." Invisible chains of gravity slammed into Stanley. He grunted as his limbs were seized by a force he couldn't see. He was dragged through the void, pulled toward the black sphere of the throat. "Stanley," Alice lunged for him, but a wall of solidified light slammed down between them. "I am doing this for you," Sagan's voice echoed, sounding almost sorrowful. "For all of you. Chaos is a cancer. Stasis is the cure. Stanley, you were born for this. You have been holding on to your guilt for 10 years. Let it become the foundation of a safe world. Be the anchor." Stanley felt the pull. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. The maw was promising him an end to the noise. If he let go, if he let himself become the statue in the center of the storm, he would never have to worry about making a wrong choice again. He would be fixed, eternal, useful. He looked at the black sphere. It looked peaceful. "Maybe he is right," Stanley whispered. "No," Grace's voice cut through the trance. Grace and Vale were moving. They weren't attacking the Warden's invisible force. They were building. Grace took the shards of her broken medical scanner, the ones she had smashed in the engine room, and tossed them into the air. Vale caught them in a telekinetic field he was generating from the choir engine's residual code. "We cannot stop the force," Vale shouted, "but we can change the friction." "Creating a resonance path," Grace yelled. "Stanley, look at the light, don't look at the dark." The shards of the scanner dissolved, mixing with the lingering energy of the resonance sample. They formed a glittering golden dust highway that cut through the red static. It didn't break the chains holding Stanley, but it illuminated the path back to his friends. It was a small act. A doctor, sacrificing her tools. A linguist calculating a vector of hope. But in a place made of symbols, it was powerful. Stanley looked at the golden dust. He looked at Grace, bruised and weaponless. He looked at Vale, terrified but working. He realized then that the warden's math was flawed. The warden treated people as variables to be solved. Stanley's friends treated him as a person to be held. The resonance point in Stanley's brain, the stubbornness that had kept him alive in the cell, flared white-hot. He planted his feet on nothingness. He stopped drifting. "I am not a statue," Stanley growled. He fought the pull. It felt like tearing his own muscles, but he turned his body away from the peaceful dark. He faced the golden path. He walked. 1 step. The red light screamed. 2 steps. The mirrors shattered. He reached the edge of the invisible barrier. He looked through it at Alice. She was pounding on the light wall, her face twisted in desperation. "Stanley!" she screamed. "Don't you dare be noble. Don't you dare leave me." Stanley placed his hand on the barrier. "I spent 10 years running from the moment I left a child behind," Stanley said. His voice was calm, carrying over the roar of the maw. "I thought my punishment was to survive, but I was wrong. My punishment was believing I was alone." He looked at the black sphere one last time, then turned his back on it completely. "If the universe needs a man to stand still so it can feel safe, then the universe is wrong," Stanley said. "I stood wrong once. This time I stand right." He pushed. The barrier didn't break, it dissolved. The sheer weight of his refusal to be a victim shattered the warden's control protocol. Stanley fell forward out of the trap. Alice caught him. She didn't hug him gently. She grabbed him by the flight suit and slammed him against a floating piece of debris, her eyes wild. "You idiot!" she hissed, her voice trembling. "You were going to do it. You were going to say yes." "I was going to save you," Stanley said. "I do not want to be saved if it means you become a piece of furniture for eternity," Alice shouted. "I do not want right if it means losing you." "Then what do we do?" Stanley asked. "The maw is still hungry." "We feed it," Vale called out, drifting toward them. "But we do not feed it a life. We feed it a connection. The dual conduit. We have to finish what we started in the engine room." "The warden is trying to jam the frequency," Grace warned, looking at the datapad. "He is flooding the core with white noise. He is trying to drown out your heartbeat." Let him try," Stanley said. He took Alice's hand. "Ready to be expensive?" Alice looked at him. Her fear was still there, but beneath it was steel. "Always." They closed their eyes. They reached for the bond they had formed in the engine. The blue light of the anchor and the gold light of the catalyst. They tried to sync. Thump, thump, it began to work. The red static wavered. The black sphere slowed its rotation. "No," Sagan's voice roared. "You are destabilizing reality. I will not let you gamble with existence." The white noise spiked. It wasn't just sound. It was data. The warden was blasting raw, unfiltered information into the connection. He was trying to overload their minds with static to break the focus. The noise hit Stanley like a physical blow. He gritted his teeth, holding on. But the noise hit Alice differently. For Alice, the noise wasn't random. As the warden's signal battered against her mental barriers, it cracked something open. The gap in her memory, the hole she had felt in the engine room, suddenly filled. It didn't fill with water. It filled with fire, Alice screamed. "Alice!" Stanley shouted, feeling her hand spasm in his. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't gold anymore. They were entirely black, consumed by the returning memory. She pulled her hand away from Stanley, as if he burned her. "No," she whispered. She floated backward, shaking her head. "No, no, no." "Alice, what is it?" Stanley asked, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "It was me." "What was you—" Alice looked at him, and the look on her face broke Stanley's heart. It was absolute crushing guilt. "The bounty," she whispered. Her voice was hollow. "The contract. The one with the rider about keeping your mind intact. The one that put a target on your back and brought every hunter in the sector down on you." She looked at her hands. "I wrote it." The battlefield of the Corps seemed to freeze. "What?" Stanley asked quietly. 2 years ago." Alice said the words, spilling out fast, frantic. "I found the prophecy of the dual conduit. I knew the maw was opening. I knew we needed an anchor. I searched the database for a resonance match. I found you. You were hiding on a backwater moon drinking yourself to death." She looked up, tears floating in the zero gravity. "I knew if I just asked you, you would say no. You were broken. You didn't care about saving the world. So I made you a target. I put the price on your head. I manipulated the warden's algorithm to make sure you were sent to the maw prison, not executed." "You sent me to the cell?" Stanley asked. "I had to get you to the starting line," Alice cried. "But I knew the engine required a true connection. It required a catalyst who wasn't lying. If I knew I was manipulating you, the engine would reject me. So you wiped your own mind," Vale whispered, horrified. "You set the board, moved the pieces, and then erased the memory of the strategy so you could play the game honestly." "I turned myself into a lie to make the truth work," Alice sobbed. She curled into herself, drifting away. "I am not a partner, Stanley. I am just another warden. I tried to control you. I am the reason you were tortured. I am the reason you were hunted." She looked at the black sphere. "The warden is right. You should let the maw take me. I am the chaos." The warden's laughter echoed through the Corps. It was a sad, victorious sound. "You see, Stanley," Sagan's voice boomed. "Trust is a variable that always fails. She used you. Everyone uses you. Only the maw offers truth. Give up." The connection was broken. The dual conduit was dead. The red static returned angrier than before. The black sphere began to expand its event horizon, widening to swallow the group. Stanley stood in the void. He looked at Alice. She was floating like a piece of drift debris waiting to be erased. He felt the anger. It was a hot, sharp thing in his chest. She had manipulated him. She had turned his life into a game. But then, he looked deeper. He saw a woman who was so terrified of the end of the world that she had sacrificed her own identity to stop it. She had erased herself, her memories, her plan, her safety, just to give him a chance to be the hero. She had made herself the villain, so he could be the savior. The warden wanted to control the future by removing choice. Alice had tried to save the future by removing her own choice, to ensure her heart was honest when it mattered. It was the most dangerously human thing he had ever heard. Stanley kicked off the debris. He flew through the void. He didn't fly away from her. He flew toward her. "Alice!" he shouted. She looked up, flinching. "Stay away, I am a monster!" Stanley grabbed her shoulders. He pulled her close, forcing her to look at him. "You are not a monster," he said. "You are a gambler." "I sold you," she cried. "You bet on me," Stanley corrected, shaking her slightly. "You bet 50,000 credits in your own mind that if you got me to the right place, I would do the right thing. You bet that I was more than a broken soldier." He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You tried to control fate, yes. That was arrogant. But then you wiped your memory. You leveled the playing field. You made yourself vulnerable to the same danger you put me in. You didn't stand above the board, Alice. You jumped onto it with me." "How can you forgive me?" she whispered. "I lied to you for 2 years." "Because I know why you did it," Stanley said. He looked at the warden's invisible presence, then back to her. "The warden acts out of fear. You acted out of hope. It was a messy, complicated, dangerous hope, but It was hope. He took her hand again. He squeezed it hard. You want to know my choice? I do not choose the safe timeline. I do not choose the silence. He pressed her palm against his chest, right over his heart. I choose the fox who was crazy enough to trick me into saving the world. I choose you. Now, with all the memories, with all the mess. Alice stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at his eyes blue, steady and devoid of judgment. You are, she choked out a laugh that sounded like a sob. You are dangerous. Only when I am right, Stanley smiled. Now, let's show the warden what real control looks like. Alice nodded. The guilt didn't vanish, but it transformed. It became fuel. She tightened her grip on his hand. Dual conduit, she whispered. Full power. They didn't just sink this time. They collided. The blue light of the anchor and the gold light of the catalyst slammed together with the force of a supernova. But it wasn't violent. It was a song. The sound that erupted from them wasn't a mechanical hum. It was a harmony. It was the sound of a human heart that had learned to forgive, beating in time with an alien heart that had learned to trust. The white noise of the warden was obliterated. The red static was swept away like smoke in a gale. The black sphere, the throat of the maw, shuddered. It tried to eat the energy, but this energy wasn't a timeline to be consumed. It was a choice, and a choice cannot be eaten. It can only be accepted. The sphere turned from black to a blinding, transparent crystal. Impossible, Sagan's voice whispered, faint now. The math, the entropy is reversing. We are not closing it, Warden, Vale shouted, watching the datapad with tears in his eyes. We are retuning it. They are teaching the maw how to sing. The mirrors in the core stopped showing shattered timelines. They began to show possibilities. In one mirror, Stanley saw himself rebuilding a house on Vesta 4. In another, he saw Alice laughing in a bar in Saffron Freeport. In another, he saw the warden sitting on a park bench feeding birds, looking at peace. The maw wasn't a trap anymore. It was a kaleidoscope of hope. The core began to shrink. The immense pressure lifted. The mirrors folded in on themselves, not breaking, but stacking neatly into the fabric of reality. In the control room of the prison, miles above Warden Rook, Sagan watched the monitors. He saw the energy readings stabilize. He saw the chaos index drop to 0, not because the subjects were dead, but because they were in harmony. He looked at his hand hovering over the purge button. He had spent his life believing that people were weak, that they needed a cage to survive. He had been ready to kill Stanley to prove it. But Stanley had just forgiven the unforgivable. Sagan's hand trembled. He realized with a sudden crushing clarity that the only person in the system who had truly been afraid was him. I was wrong, he whispered to the empty room. He moved his hand. He didn't hit purge. He hit stabilize. He rerouted the prison's power reserves to reinforce the dual conduit, adding his own strength to the song. It was a silent apology, a resignation. Let them go, Sagan commanded the computer. And the lockdown. The light faded. Stanley and Alice were floating in the center of the chamber. The maw was gone. In its place was a small, floating crystal, no bigger than a fist, pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic light. Reality had settled. The gravity returned to normal slowly, gently lowering them to the floor. Stanley's knees buckled. Alice caught him. They collapsed together on the smooth white floor, gasping for air. Is it over? Grace asked, crawling out from behind a pillar. It is done, Vale said, approaching the floating crystal with reverence. The maw is dormant. It is not hungry anymore. It is full. Stanley looked at Alice. She looked exhausted. Her fur was matted with sweat, her armor scorched. But her eyes were clear. He felt something strange, a sensation in the back of his mind. He could feel her relief. He could feel the ache in her shoulder. He could feel the warmth of her hand, before she even touched him. "Get out of my head," Stanley murmured, but there was no heat in it. Alice smiled tiredly. "You get out of mine. You are thinking very loud thoughts about breakfast." "I am thinking about being alive," Stanley said. "That too," she agreed. They sat there for a long time, the four of them in the silence of a saved world. 3 days later. The rust bucket sat on the landing pad of a neutral outpost on the edge of the ash ring. The wind was still blowing, but it didn't feel like it was scraping the skin off the world anymore. It just felt like wind. Grace was packing her medical gear. She had decided to stay in the ring. "There are a lot of people here who need a doctor who doesn't ask for ID," she had said. "And I have a new resonance theory to test on tissue regeneration." Dr. Vale was heading back to the university, or what was left of it. He had the recordings of the choir engine. "I am going to write a paper," he said, adjusting his taped glasses. "I am going to call it The Syntax of Mercy. The academic board will hate it. It will be glorious." Stanley and Alice stood by the airlock ramp. Stanley wore a new jacket. It didn't have any rank insignia. It just had pockets. "So," Stanley said, looking at the horizon, "the bounty board cleared the contract. The warden resigned. We are officially unemployed." "I am not unemployed," Alice said, leaning against the hull. "I am a freelancer. There is a difference." "What is the plan?" Stanley asked. "Go back to hunting." Alice looked at him. She tapped the side of her head. "I cannot hunt anymore, Stanley. I have a connection to a stubborn human in my brain. Every time you get moral, I get a headache. It would ruin my stealth." "Sorry about that," Stanley grinned. "Besides," Alice said, looking down at her boots, "we still have the crystal. The maw is closed here, but the deserter said there are other fractures. Other places where the silence is leaking in. They need tuning." "So we are cosmic repairmen now?" Stanley asked. "Something like that," Alice said. "The pay is terrible. The hours are worse. And the partner is annoying. But, Alice looked up, her golden eyes shining. "I hear the retirement benefits are great. You get to sleep at night." Stanley laughed. He extended his hand. "Ready to go, partner." Alice looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. "One question," she said. "Yeah. Back in the Corps," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When you chose me, was it because of the money, or was it because of the heartbeat?" Stanley looked at her. He felt the bond hum between them, warm, unbreakable and true. "It started as the money," Stanley said deadpan. Alice raised an eyebrow. "But then," Stanley softened his thumb, brushing her knuckles, "I discovered you were much more expensive than I thought. 50,000 credits is cheap. Keeping you out of trouble, that is going to cost me a lifetime." Alice laughed, a bright, clear sound that chased away the last echoes of the ash ring's wind. "Put it on my tab," she said. "I am good for it." "I know," Stanley said. "I saw your credit rating. It is terrible. But your character references are excellent." They turned and walked up the ramp of the rust bucket. The engines flared to life, not with a roar, but with a hum, a harmonious sound ready to cross the stars. The ship lifted off, turning its nose toward the deep black. They weren't running away this time. They were heading toward the next fracture, the next silence, the next person who needed to know that even when the universe breaks, you can choose to put it back together, one small act of kindness at a time.